Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Tattered Cover Bookstore, it's my pleasure to welcome you and to thank you for supporting independent bookstores. Vivian Spitz is a fellow of the Academy of Professional Reporters of the National Court Reporters Association and was an official reporter of debates and chief reporter in the United States House of Representatives from 1972 until 1982. In 1978, she reported President Carter's establishment of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, appointing world-famous Holocaust survivor and later Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel as chairman. By contract with the United States War Department, Mrs. Spitz reported the Nuremberg war crimes trials in Germany from 1946 until 1948. Since 1987, she has made presentations on the Nazi doctor's case to over 45,000 students and adults in the United States, Canada, and Singapore. In recognition of her presentations to refute the claims of Holocaust deniers, she has received 5 National Humanitarian Awards. On December 22, 1995, the Steven Spielberg Visual History Foundation conducted a videotaped interview of her as a witness to history. In April 2001, the late Tony Randall, producer of Judgment at Nuremberg on Broadway, had her appear on stage following a performance to speak. On April 25, 2005, she appeared on CNN's Aaron Brown Newsnight, launching the publication of her book, Doctors from Hell, the horrific account of Nazi experiments on humans. The book is now in the University of Colorado Medical School bookstore and is in the Deadly Medicine exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum until October 15th. On the cover of the 3rd edition, now being printed, will appear Elie Wiesel's endorsement as follows. Read Vivian Spitz's personal memoir with its shattering memories from the Nuremberg trials, and you will encounter physicians who, corrupted by Nazi ideology, brought shame to their profession. After tonight's presentation, Vivian will be glad to answer questions and sign copies of her book. We are honored and delighted that Vivian Spitz is with us this evening. Would you please join me now in making her feel welcome?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening on the Nazi doctor's case of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. I want to just tell you a bit about how I came to report these trials in Nuremberg at such a young age. In 1905, a Spanish-born, Harvard-educated philosopher named George Santayana wrote a 5-volume work entitled The Life of Reason. In it he stated, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and for years now, a mission of mine has been to speak about that past to which Santayana referred, especially to all who were born after 1945, the year the Nuremberg war crimes trials commenced. These trials, from November 1945 through April 1949, were the first international criminal trials in all of history, with 4 countries, the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, trying the leaders of one country, Germany, for crimes against humanity and calculated genocide, perpetrated over a period of 12 years, from 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, until 1945, when World War II ended. These trials were concerned with 3 major points: basic human rights and the dignity of life, the difference between good and evil, and indifference to evil. In a crime, there is always a perpetrator and a victim. look the other way, don't get involved, remain silent, and you will always help the perpetrator and never the victim. By the end of World War II on May 8, 1945, most of the major Nazi leaders who had not already committed suicide were in the hands of U.S. and British troops. Rather than stand them up against a wall and shoot them on the spot, or try them immediately in summary proceedings, the United States, among the big four powers, pushed for a fair trial before an international military tribunal in which all accused would be given every opportunity to present their cases. The tribunal would be committed to strict rules of evidence, growing out of centuries of legal experience and the development of law and order among nations. Serious and heated debate went on for many months among the delegates to the big four powers, finally culminating in a charter agreement at the London Conference in August of 1945, establishing the International Military Tribunal. The Palace of Justice at Nuremberg was selected because Nuremberg had been the site of the huge Nazi Party rallies. The horror story of Nazism began unfolding before the eyes and ears of the world at Nuremberg on November 20, 1945. The case was titled, "In the Matter of the United States of America, the French Republic, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics versus Hermann Wilhelm Goering and 21 other major Nazi leaders." The 66-page indictment of 4 counts charged a common conspiracy to seize power, establish a totalitarian regime, plan, prepare, initiate, and wage wars of aggression, the violation of the laws of war, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and crimes of persecution and extermination. Now, the Nazis had meticulously recorded, by documentation, film, and photography, almost all of their atrocities, because tens of thousands of pieces of documentary evidence had been captured by the U.S. and Allied forces. Most facts presented at the trials were incapable of being denied or defended. Of 22 defendants in the major Nazi leaders' case, 19 were held accountable for their crimes individually, not collectively. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. 10 were hanged on October 16, 1946, and 4 hours before Goering was to be hanged, he swallowed a cyanide capsule which he had been able to hide on his body. On May 8, 1945, when the war ended, I was on my first job in Detroit with a freelance court reporting agency. Publicity about the impending trials was on the front pages of the newspapers all across the country and in the movie theaters on the Movietone newsreels. We did not have television at that time. Then into our Detroit office one day came a flyer from the United States War Department to change my life significantly. Approximately 26 court reporters were being recruited from all over the United States to go to Germany to report not only Goering's trial, but the 12 subsequent trials, of which the Nazi doctor's trial was the first. I applied immediately, wondering if I could possibly be selected. Me, with so little experience and with so few to be selected. I waited anxiously in Detroit to hear from the War Department, and I soon heard. I was too young. I had to be 21, and I was only 20. So the next months in Detroit were unbearable for me as I just tried to grow old as fast as I could. The first wave of reporters had already been selected for Goering's trial, but as soon as I was 21, I signed a contract with the War Department and received my orders in late October 1946, assigned to the Office of Chief of Counsel for War Crimes, Nuremberg, Germany. On November 6, 1946, I arrived in cold, snowy, bombed-out Nuremberg, presented my orders to the proper military authorities, and was driven to my first assigned home, which I shared for several months with one young British woman and one young French woman on the Allied payroll, neither of whom could I understand. For security reasons, we were picked up every morning at our front gate by a displaced person on the Allied payroll in a German car and driven to the iron gates of the Palace of Justice. Now, with the trial of the major Nazi leaders over, the British, the French, and the Soviets packed up and went to their separate zones in Germany to try other defendants. However, many of their language experts stayed on to work on the 12 subsequent trials. On October 25, 1946, the United States only filed an indictment against 20 Nazi doctors and 3 medical assistants entitled The United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., and thus commenced the first and most horrifying of the 12 subsequent trials. I wanted this trial more than any of the others, including Goering's trial, and I was one of the 6 reporters selected to report it from the beginning to the end. Now, who were these defendants in the doctor's case? Karl Brandt was not only Hitler's personal physician, but he was the chief architect of the program and the machinery which turned doctors who had taken the oath of Hippocrates to heal and cure, turned into doctors who became torturers and murderers. In most cases, they were distinguished German scientists, chief surgeons and physicians at institutes, clinics, hospitals, and universities all throughout Germany. They were the doctors at the concentration camps who performed the grisly medical experiments, all very sadistic men and one woman. With what crimes were they charged? With the outright murder of political prisoners, civilians, intellectual dissidents, non-German nationals, Catholic and Protestant clergy, and prisoners of war through medical experimentation without their consent in the name of scientific medical research. Those who did not die or who were not murdered suffered torture, maiming, and permanent disfigurement and disability. The victims were nameless, ordered like cattle in wholesale lots. Of 200 Jews in good physical condition, 50 gypsies, 500 tubercular Poles, 1,000 Russian prisoners of war. The 23 doctors and medical assistants were charged with 12 major experiments carried out from 1939 to 1945 at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Natzweiler, Sachsenhausen, and other camps. The first experiment charged with high altitude. Victims were locked in airtight ball-shaped compartments, and the pressure was altered to simulate high-altitude atmospheric conditions up to 68,000 feet without oxygen. The approximately 200 victims were Russian and Polish Jews who were termed professional criminals. Why? Because they had been condemned for racial shame consisting of marriage or intercourse between non-Aryans and Aryans, the term given to pure-blooded Germans. Their punishment was the torture of over 120 and the murder of 70 to 80. The second experiment was freezing. conducted to determine the most effective means of heating severely chilled or frozen people. The victims were placed in long, narrow tanks of ice water for up to 3 hours, at which point death occurred, or by keeping them outdoors naked 9 to 14 hours in sub-freezing temperatures. They screamed in pain as parts of their bodies froze. Rewarming of those who did not die was most effective by very hot baths. Then Heinrich Himmler, chief of the Gestapo and one of the major Nazi leaders who committed suicide after his capture by the British and therefore was never tried, ordered rewarming by naked women. At one point, 4 gypsy prostitutes, themselves prisoners, were produced from Ravensbrück concentration camp, and the chilled to unconsciousness naked male victim was placed between 2 naked women, indicating the obscene sickness of Himmler and his doctors. Malaria experiments were conducted on German prisoners of war, Russians, Yugoslavs, and a large number of Polish Catholic priests who were infected with malaria through controlled infected mosquito bites or by the injections of malaria-infected blood. These victims suffered permanent disability and approximately 400 deaths, 1/3 of the total number of experimental subjects. Mustard gas experiments were conducted to investigate the most effective treatment of mustard gas wounds. 1 drop of a liquid gas substance was applied to the lower arm of the experimental subject. 10 hours later, burns appeared and spread over the entire body wherever drops contacted the skin. Photos were taken daily. Fatalities started occurring after the 5th day. Greater parts of the lungs and other organs were eaten away. Some of the victims were forced to enter the gas chamber, smash small ampules of liquid gas, and inhale the vapor. With the same results, their lungs were destroyed. Of approximately 220 victims, over 50 died. The 5th experiment was sulfanilamide. I'm not going to detail every one of these experiments for you because they are all in the book. One of the most savage, sadistic, and inhumane experiments was bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and bone transplantation, in which whole sections of bone, whole legs taken off at the hips, muscles, nerves, arms, including scapulas, were removed from healthy victims and attempted to be transplanted to other healthy victims. These were predominantly young Polish women, which resulted for the most part in death, but for those who lived, mutilation and permanent disability. The 7th experiment was seawater. To develop a method of making seawater drinkable. The victims were German, Czech, and Polish gypsies, deprived of food and given only brackish yellow seawater for days, resulting in excruciating pain, foaming at the mouth, and eventually, in most cases, madness. One of the most dramatic courtroom scenes occurred during my turn in the courtroom. Karl Hohenreiner, a dark-haired man of small stature, nervous and very excitable, assumed the witness stand. The main courtroom of the Palace of Justice loomed very large before him. It was June 27, 1947. Now, witness, for what reasons were you arrested by the Gestapo on 29 May 1944? The question was asked in English and simultaneously interpreted into German. The answer given in German, interpreted through the English channel of my earphones, was, "Because I am a gypsy of mixed blood." The Reich citizenship law dated September 15, 1935 read, Jews and Gypsies cannot become citizens. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor, dated November 14, 1935, another of the infamous Nuremberg laws, read, a marriage shall furthermore not be contracted if the progeny to be expected from it would endanger the purity of German blood. Karl Hohenreiner was first sent to Auschwitz, then to Buchenwald, and then Dachau, where seawater experiments tortured his mind and body for days. Question: do you think you would be able to recognize that doctor if you saw him today? Answer: yes, immediately. I would recognize him at once. Question: would you kindly stand up from your witness chair, take your earphones off, and proceed over to the defendant's dock and see if you can recognize the professor that you met at Dachau? Everyone in the courtroom waited tensely. I watched this little man as he stood up. He paused for just a moment, his eyes seemingly fixed on a doctor in the second row of the prisoner's box. Then in a flash, he was gone from the witness stand, seeming to almost leap over the ends of the German Defense Counsel's tables. He appeared to be almost flying through the air toward the prisoner's dock with his right arm stretched high, reaching for Dr. Biegelbach, the consulting physician to the German Air Force. Amid the scramble of defense counsel bending away from him and momentary shock and confusion in that courtroom, 3 of our American military policemen rushed from behind the prisoner's dock and grabbed this little man almost in mid-air, futilely bent on delivering his own brand of justice. I did not see a weapon, but I was told later by an American military police officer that he had been able to hide a dagger on his person. The 8th experiment was epidemic jaundice. The 9th experiment was sterilization, conducted on Russian prisoners of war and Polish Jews to develop a suitable method for the sterilization of millions of people by radiation, drugs, and surgery in a planned mass genocide of large population groups. This resulted in horrible physical and mental pain and anguish. The 10th experiment was typhus, conducted to determine the effectiveness of vaccines. The experimental subjects were not only German criminals taken from their own jails, but Poles, Russians, Frenchmen, and prisoners of war. The purpose was to manufacture a typhus convalescent serum. Infection was accomplished by laceration of the skin and the introduction of a typhus culture by contagious lice or by the intravenous or intramuscular injection of fresh blood containing the typhus virus. Now, to maintain a constant source of infected fresh blood, 3 to 5 inmates per month were artificially infected with typhus. These victims became raving mad, suffered delirium, and over 90% died a slow and frightful death. And in Denver, we have a survivor of this experiment who told me that of 50 men selected from his block at Buchenwald, only 17 survived, and he was one of them. The 11th experiment was poison. Now, some of these 12 experiments had absolutely no scientific objective to heal or cure, but rather to kill or exterminate, and this was one of them. Poison bullets were shot into Russian prisoners of war, not to test an antidote for poison, but to time how fast death occurred taking up to 2 hours and 9 minutes. Poison was also secretly administered in food, and the doctors stood behind curtains to watch the reactions. These victims suffered excruciating torture, and all died or were deliberately killed to permit autopsies. The last major experiment was incendiary bomb, to test the effect of pharmaceutical preparations on phosphorus burns. The victims were inflicted with phosphorus from the bombs, and then the wounds ignited, burning the skin for up to 68 seconds before extinguishing, resulting in intense pain and suffering. At one time, 112 Jews were selected to complete a skeleton collection for the Reich University in Strasbourg, France, under Nazi occupation. Photographs and anthropological measurements were taken, and the victims were killed and defleshed. And on the cover of the book is the picture of the doctor who was not a doctor, a medical assistant who was in charge of this experiment. Military tribunal was established on October 25, 1946, to hear the medical case, concluded on July 19, 1947, after the introduction of 1,471 pieces of documentary evidence. 4 doctors, including Karl Brandt, were sentenced to death by hanging, 5 to life imprisonment, 2 to 20 years, 1 to 15 years, 1 to 10 years, and 7 were found not guilty and released. At Karl Brandt's execution on November 2, 1948, before he fell through the trap door, he declared, "It is no shame to stand on this scaffold. I served my fatherland as others before me." There was not one scintilla of any kind of remorse shown on the part of any one of these doctors or assistants, including the 7 who were acquitted. The court, in its detailed final judgment, set forth 10 points regarding permissible medical experiments known as the Nuremberg Code, which was the starting point for research guidelines. The code has been extended by the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki with subsequent additions and continues in use today. Now, all of this horror story was to be the final solution of the Jewish question. Here were people who had this happen to them just for being who they were. This was coordinated evil and hatred on a scale unprecedented by a modern civilized society of my heritage. I am not Jewish, I am half German. A society that produced such brilliant writers, composers, and scientists as Goethe, Kant, Bach, Beethoven, and yes, Wagner, Hitler's favorite, Bessel, Röntgen, and Einstein. Adolf Hitler was not criminally insane, he was criminally sane, a link to our common humanity, which should make us all think about it. Our humanity is also linked to the 6 million Jews and the millions of non-Jews who made up the almost 11 million victims of the Holocaust. Now, one cannot easily comprehend that figure until one sees a copy of the orders at the Treblinka death camp in Poland, for example, for the extermination of 14,000 per day. Now, the non-Jewish world did not talk much about this, educate about it, or commemorate it for almost 30 years after it happened, and I could never understand why. Then on November 1, 1978, while I was chief reporter of debates in the United States House of Representatives, President Jimmy Carter, by executive order, established the President's Commission on the Holocaust, appointing the later Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel as chairman. On April 2, 1979, President Carter, by proclamation, designated April 28 and 29, 1979, as Days of Remembrance of Victims of the Holocaust, asking the people of the United States to observe this solemn anniversary of the liberation of Dachau by U.S. Armed Forces on April 28 and 29 of 1945. This is the story of the mass violation of basic human rights and the dignity of life, of indifference to evil, of people who knew and kept silent, of heads of state who looked the other way, including our own, and of church leaders, too many church leaders, who did not speak out against what was happening. I was neither a witness nor a victim, but I was a verbatim court reporter of the words that came from their mouths at Nuremberg. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, wrote a letter to Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall describing his first visit to one of the camps by U.S. forces. Quote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where there were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda, and that is precisely what is happening throughout the world today with the insidious spread of Holocaust denial. I have been seriously confronted twice by Holocaust deniers. The largest organization in the United States is the Institute for Historical Review, based in Newport Beach, California. I was first confronted by them in 1997 when I was speaking at the Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs to judges and lawyers. A third attorney came up to us before we got started and said, "Someone is handing out propaganda to the lawyers who are registering." At that moment, this man came bounding up across the floor to me with a big smile on his face, handed me 3 sheets of a document, and asked me if I was familiar with their institute. I looked at the title and said, "I am very familiar with your institute, Institute for Historical Review, but you do not have the correct title at the top. It should be Institute for Historical Revision and Holocaust Denial." Then his demeanor changed. He became hostile to me and challenged me to debate him, not only on the Holocaust, but on the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which, you understand, were a staged production put on by the 4 countries, and all of the photographs are fake. I said to him, "I will not only not debate you, I will not dignify with an answer any question you put to me. I have nothing further to say to you." Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and we have not remembered well. We must learn from the lessons of the past to help us overcome our hatreds and prejudices of today, to structure our future with faith, hope, and dedication to humanity with international understanding, peace, and justice. Thank you very much for listening to me. Now we're going to take questions. First one side of the room and then the next.
Can you tell us something about tattoo removal for high rank collection, private collection of Nazis?
Pardon me?
Tattoo removed from prisoners?
Oh, the tattoos removed from the prisoners.
Right.
That was Ilsa Koch. That was in another trial that I did not report. But yes, indeed, that did occur. Especially with downed airmen, U.S. airmen, who had tattoos. They made lampshades out of them and other items. But that was not part of my trial, so I cannot give you details on that.
What was the rationale behind the letting the certain doctors off completely? How could they be dismissed from their crimes?
Her question was, what was the rationale for letting the 7 doctors off and not be accountable for their crimes? I was shocked at this, as many of us were. I would not have been shocked had there been 3 doctors acquitted. But you have to remember that the world was watching these trials. The international press was there from 20 different countries. And there had never been trials like these in the history of civilization before. I feel that the judges, especially the American judges, who were the judges on the 12 subsequent trials, bent over backwards to show the world that these were not trials of the victors over the vanquished, but rather of justice over evil.
Did you get to meet Rudolf Hess and what's his name, Fatso Goering, and Albert Speers? Did you get to talk to them personally?
Young. I was too young when that trial went on, and I did not report that trial. I was waiting in Detroit to get old enough to get there to report the doctor's trial, which was the trial I wanted, with no assurance that I was going to get it, but I did. Yes.
What did you want to do, especially the doctor's trial?
The doctors were not the political or military leaders. They were the educated scientists who had sworn to do no harm to their patients. They were a totally different category. I wanted to take their testimony to try to understand how they could. In my book, I go through in great detail every single one of these experiments through the testimony of the witnesses whom I actually reported and recorded their words. Yeah, it was yours. Okay. He's got one here. Thank you.
Since the Nazis were known for keeping meticulous records of all of this and all the other things which they did, how do you feel about the ethical question whether or not any of the findings which they got from this horrific work to make it usable in the scientific community, if it has any use? I mean, is there an ethical question in your mind whether or not?
In my mind, very, very much an ethical question. That question has been debated for all of these years by doctors, but I felt that from what I learned at Nuremberg, these experiments were not conducted with proper medical experimental protocols in place. And I felt that it was totally unethical because they had performed the experiments on these victims to the point of death without their consent. This is a question that is better answered by the doctor.
I have a daughter who is a court reporter. She just graduated recently, and she had 4 years of training. And I was just interested in what kind of training did you have, and were there very many court reporters at that time? Was it a pretty new field at that time? And were you able to tell people that you had to get their report and they had to slow down? Because I understand that she can do that now.
Court reporters have been, the first court reporters were in the 1800s, and they were newspaper reporters for the Boston Globe. And they sat in the chambers in Congress and wrote in longhand. And they were called reporters. Now, our court reporters now are required to go through 2 to 4 years of education. They become broadcast captioners on real time. It is an expanding field. I graduated from a business college in Chicago. I used the Gregg shorthand system of reporting, which is no longer in existence. You know what that is. I passed a high-speed National Court Reporters Association examination at 260 words a minute, which is what, there were only 4 of us in the country at that time, writing Gregg shorthand in pen and ink. But we had to have that. You have to pass the high speeds required in the testing procedures. The state of Colorado requires 225 words a minute. And when I went to Congress, I wrote at 260 words a minute by the time I got there. The world speed champion writes at 280 words a minute. So, I mean, it's a great field. It is a great field. And she asked, you know, if you have to slow them down. In Nuremberg, when I do a longer, full presentation, I tell about how the court reporters worked Nuremberg. We had half shorthand reporters, like I was, with a pen and a reporter's notebook, half stenotype reporters. And we could never, nor in Congress, can we ever interrupt Ted Kennedy, anybody else who's speaking, especially a Ted Kennedy who never ends a sentence. And I reported him over a period of 3 years. But you just have to, sometimes we had congressmen who loved to reel off a sentence, as did Jim Wright in Texas, in Spanish. And then we wrote sounds, and I went to the congressman later and asked him to translate for me or spell those Spanish words in Spanish, if that's what he wanted to see in the congressional record, which nobody else could read. But in the courtroom, you can, if you get behind, or if you have a witness that is not intelligible, and you can't understand it. But I just don't ever remember having to stop anybody. Now, in Nuremberg, the interpreters are the ones who had the problems, because we reporters had to wait for the interpreters to translate the words. And I don't know German, but I understand that in German, the verb comes at the end of the sentence, and so the interpreter had to wait until the end of the sentence to get the verb, and the court reporter waited for the interpreter, and then he telescoped that sentence as fast as he possibly could, because the next sentence is already being spoken. But at any rate, if a reporter is qualified, they can handle it. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Two questions. Were there other reporters who translated, or were they only transcribed in English for the Nuremberg trials? And when did you decide to write your book? And tell us about that.
I'm going to answer your second question first, Tony. Thank you very much for it. Reporting these trials caused me so many problems. I was so horrified by it that as soon as I got back to this country, I started having nightmares. And I was always escaping through a tunnel. For some reason, with 4 or 5 small children, I was escaping from a concentration camp, and therefore it might have been Terezin, the children's camp, in a tunnel. And I was trying to keep these children quiet because the Nazi guard was marching back and forth along the barbed wire fence with his bayoneted rifle. I didn't want the guard to hear the children. I kept looking for the light at the end of that tunnel. This went on for 3 years. And it was pure torture for me. And I was so horrified that I could not speak about it. I have empathy with the survivors, and I don't know whether we have survivors in this room, but I've spoken to, I think, most of them in the Jewish community here in Denver. But I was so horrified, I never talked about it. I never talked about it. I was an official reporter in the Denver District Court within 8 years after I got back from Nuremberg. And I didn't talk about it, no one talked about it. And I just shoved it all in the back of my mind and thought nothing about it until 1987, when in Denver we had a high school teacher in a high school in Aurora who referred to the Holocaust to her senior students as the Holocaust. She claimed that she was trying to make her students do critical thinking. But at any rate, I was just livid, and I decided to get my material and photographs. And in my full presentation, I do a PowerPoint. I couldn't do it here tonight because of time, but I have 38 captured German film, and I got all of that out, which I had stored in boxes for 40 years, and I put together a lecture, which I started giving in 1989, all over the country, thousands and thousands of students who were my target audiences. And then, in 1995, the Steven Spielberg Foundation interviewed me here in Denver, and I was beginning to get confrontations by Holocaust deniers claiming that it never happened. And in 1999, I was speaking at the Long Beach Hilton Hotel to a good-sized audience. The LA Times gave me huge publicity in advance the day before, and as a result, the Hilton Hotel received calls from, quote, historians asking where and when in the hotel I would be speaking, and not whether they could attend. The hotel told them it was a private professional association, not open to the public, They demanded that they be allowed to go in. And the hotel called me the night before I flew in to LA and asked me to register under an assumed name. They would put on additional security. I flew in, registered under another name, and I spoke on Saturday afternoon to this large group. My presentation is about an hour and a half long, including the slides. And at the end, when people were asking me questions, suddenly the doors to the right of me flew open, and an armed security guard with a gun on his hip came up to me on the podium and said quietly, "I have to take you off the podium right now." I knew something was happening, and I went right with him behind the podium, out the door, into an elevator there, and down to the basement for protection. So at that time, I decided it's time I write this book. And recently, a doctor asked me how I felt. Doctors have received the book extremely well. Asked me how I felt now that I have the book finished. And I said, I have found the light at the end of that tunnel. Thank you.
Vivian, can you tell me if your stenograph notes still exist? If so, where are they stored?
They're in archives in Maryland.
I see, okay.
My notes of the Nuremberg trials.
I see, okay.
They're all in archives.
I see.
And I want to tell you that the court reporter's transcript of the doctor's trial is 11,538 pages long in archives. And the staff, the attorneys and staff at Nuremberg condensed those 11,000 pages down to 1,300, which you can get in one of the 42 volumes in the Denver Public Library on the 5th floor in the Government Documents section, volumes 1 and part of volume 2. And this is my transcript, and it is from the 1,300 pages that I have prepared this book, and I have gotten what I considered to be the most important points and put them in this book. So the book, now you can read the story for 300 pages instead of 11,000. Somebody back there has a question.
Are you scheduled to give your extended lecture with the PowerPoint at any time in the Denver area in the next year?
I hate to tell you this, but I am moving to Houston in December. However, I am booked to my eyeballs right now into September 2006 around the country. But I don't have, I just did Regis University on March 29 to an overflow crowd there, which CNN from Los Angeles filmed. But I'm sorry to tell you that I don't have anything booked, and I don't have time. I have a commitment to one Denver doctor to speak to a group of doctors and dentists before I leave town. There's somebody here. Yes.
How did you get the photographs and the other memorabilia that you have?
The photographs? The one in the book?
No, that you were saying that you have art.
I got them when I was in Nuremberg. They were given to us if we wanted them in the court reporter's office. Now, the pictures that I have in the book, in the book at one point, I have a bin of legs taken off at the hips. Now, those pictures were received in evidence in Nuremberg, and I had copies of them. I mean, for some reason, I grabbed onto everything I could get or that they offered there. And as far as the mug shots of all of the doctors in the book, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., at my request, sent the photographs to my publisher in Boulder. This is Carl Brandt. And when you read my book, you will read about my first day going into the courtroom and looking at all of the defendants and scanning those defendants in the 2 rows, right to left. And Carl Brandt sat in the first seat in the first row on the left, seat number 1. None of the other doctors paid attention to me as I looked. This was before I started writing, except this one. And he was staring into my eyes with such evil and so intently that I was shocked. I felt a chill, and then I put my head down to start writing. The Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who prosecuted that trial, noticed it. And he said to me shortly after that, that he felt it was because I was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. His Aryan. But that's how I got the photographs. And the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I have contributed photographs. In the book, I have a picture of the doctors in the dock, and I contributed that photograph to the museum in Washington, D.C., and several others in there that I have. Okay, let's see, who's next?
After reporting on such hatred and seeing such hatred in someone's eyes, how do you keep hope for humanity? How do you stay positive?
Oh, I belong to the Optimist Club. I do. I'm an optimist. Yes. Yes.
How have young people responded to your presentations?
How have young people responded to my presentation? Very well. We have done a great job in Denver of educating the children. For 12 years, I was on the Anne Frank Art and Writing Competition with Teresa Messinger as chairman, who is in the back of the room. And we worked, well, I think we started that first year educating 8 to 18 in competition. And we had 56 entries, I believe, the first year. 51. And the last year, 2002...
yeah, we were close to 4,000. We just missed it by about 20. We were 4,800 and some, yes, entries.
Yes, for 12 years we worked together to educate the students in Denver in all the schools. We even had entries from other states. Yes.
How large was the network of doctors in Germany? How would you know how many there were that were involved in these experiments besides your cases that you were on? And how would that have affected the medical profession in Germany afterwards, seeing as they let off 7 of the more important criminals? How would you trust the German physicians after the war?
The German physicians, I understood that there were between 200 and 300 German doctors who were involved in experiments, but we only were able to get 20. Now, in 1945, a very important trial occurred in Dachau. This was an American military court trial in which they convicted Dr. Schilling, some of the most infamous of the doctors, and hanged them there. I mean, we hanged, 7. Dachau hanged close to 40. Now, I do not know, I cannot answer the question about the doctors subsequently, but I think it's not a happy answer. There are too many doctors who were involved in these experiments, who got away, and who are still involved today, even in their 80s, in the medical practice. I hope I am correct on that. I have my doctor expert up here. Yes.
Given the number of genocidal massacres that have occurred in the last 50 years, like Indonesia, Cambodia, Rwanda, what do you think we've learned?
The answer to your question is we haven't. That's all I can say. Genocides are continuing. We haven't, and I think that's a question that I point out in my book. Why haven't we learned the lessons?
Was Dr. Mengele tried in absentia at your trial?
No, he asked a good question. Everybody wants to know about Dr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, who was the angel of death at Auschwitz, who experimented on children, who would stand at the ramp and select the pregnant Jews to save them so that when their babies were born, he could experiment on them. Mengele was hiding in a stable in Germany all the time I worked there. He got away. He actually was in Auschwitz when the Russian armies got to Auschwitz. And he knew the end was coming. So he and his band of 6 or 7 left and started walking to Germany. And when they got to the border, by that time, American military policemen were at the borders and checked the information on these people. He gave his name, Joseph Mengele. It meant nothing to an American GI or to anybody at that time. And so he was released. And his family were very wealthy manufacturers in Bavaria. And they were able to hide him in a stable. I mean, as a stable hand on a farm in Bavaria until he escaped to South America. Okay? Charles. Age. In 1905, a Spanish-born, Harvard-educated philosopher named George Santayana wrote a 5-volume work entitled The Life of Reason. In it he stated, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and for years now, a mission of mine has been to speak about that past to which Santayana referred, especially to all who were born after 1945, the year the Nuremberg war crimes trials commenced. These trials, from November 1945 through April 1949, were the first international criminal trials in all of history, with 4 countries, the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, trying the leaders of one country, Germany, for crimes against humanity and calculated genocide, perpetrated over a period of 12 years, from 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, until 1945, when World War II ended. These trials were concerned with 3 major points: basic human rights and the dignity of life, the difference between good and evil. The horror story of Nazism began unfolding before the eyes and ears of the world at Nuremberg on November 20, 1945. The case was titled In the matter of the United States of America, the French Republic, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics versus Hermann Wilhelm Goering and 21 other major Nazi leaders. The 66-page indictment of 4 counts charged a common conspiracy to seize power, establish a totalitarian regime, plan, prepare, initiate, and wage wars of aggression, the violation of the laws of war, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and crimes of persecution and extermination. Now, the Nazis had meticulously recorded by documentation, film, and photography almost all of their atrocities, because tens of thousands of pieces of documentary evidence had been captured by the U.S. and Allied forces. Most facts presented at the trials were incapable of being denied or defended. Of 22 defendants in the major Nazi leaders' case, 19 were held accountable for their crimes individually, not collectively.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Tattered Cover Bookstore, it's my pleasure to welcome you and to thank you for supporting independent bookstores. Vivian Spitz is a fellow of the Academy of Professional Reporters of the National Court Reporters Association and was an official reporter of debates and chief reporter in the United States House of Representatives from 1972 until 1982. In 1978, she reported President Carter's establishment of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, appointing world-famous Holocaust survivor and later Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel as chairman. By contract with the United States War Department, Mrs. Spitz reported the Nuremberg war crimes trials in Germany from 1946 until 1948. Since 1987, she has made presentations on the Nazi doctor's case to over 45,000 students and adults in the United States, Canada, and Singapore. In recognition of her presentations to refute the claims of Holocaust deniers, she has received 5 National Humanitarian Awards. On December 22, 1995, the Steven Spielberg Visual History Foundation conducted a videotaped interview of her as a witness to history. In April 2001, the late Tony Randall, producer of Judgment at Nuremberg on Broadway, had her appear on stage following a performance to speak. On April 25, 2005, she appeared on CNN's Aaron Brown Newsnight, launching the publication of her book, Doctors from Hell, the horrific account of Nazi experiments on humans. The book is now in the University of Colorado Medical School bookstore and is in the Deadly Medicine exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum until October 15th. On the cover of the 3rd edition, now being printed, will appear Elie Wiesel's endorsement as follows. Read Vivian Spitz's personal memoir with its shattering memories from the Nuremberg trials, and you will encounter physicians who, corrupted by Nazi ideology, brought shame to their profession. After tonight's presentation, Vivian will be glad to answer questions and sign copies of her book. We are honored and delighted that Vivian Spitz is with us this evening. Would you please join me now in making her feel welcome?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening on the Nazi doctor's case of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. I want to just tell you a bit about how I came to report these trials in Nuremberg at such a young and indifference to evil. In a crime, there is always a perpetrator and a victim. Look the other way, don't get involved, remain silent, and you will always help the perpetrator and never the victim. By the end of World War II on May 8, 1945, most of the major Nazi leaders who had not already committed suicide were in the hands of U.S. and British troops. Rather than stand them up against a wall and shoot them on the spot, or try them immediately in summary proceedings, the United States, among the big four powers, pushed for a fair trial before an international military tribunal in which all accused would be given every opportunity to present their cases. The tribunal would be committed to strict rules of evidence, growing out of centuries of legal experience and the development of law and order among nations. Serious and heated debate went on for many months among the delegates to the big four powers, finally culminating in a charter agreement at the London Conference in August of 1945, establishing the International Military Tribunal. The Palace of Justice at Nuremberg was selected because Nuremberg had been the site of the huge Nazi Party rallies.